So now I request Faria to start the session. Okay, introduce the speakers.
Welcome back, everybody. So there is a word in the Assamese language, and the word is bhat kumoti, which refers to a very specific type of drowsiness that you feel after a very hearty meal, usually one that sort of includes rice. I am Faria Hilali, and I am referring to this word because we cannot really afford to give in to bhat kumoti now, for we have a very, very engaging session planned ahead, which will be chaired by Professor Inakshay Mitra. Professor Inakshi Mitra is a senior faculty at the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi North Campus. She specializes in the areas of analytic philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of later Wittgenstein, logic, philosophy of mind, philosophy of action, history of Western philosophy, comparative philosophy, and has done extensive research in these fields, publishing in various journals along with myriad book chapters. Having published books later Wittgenstein on language and mathematics in the Journal of Indian Council of Philosophical Research, the breadth of her research work is depicted through her talks presented at various conferences on various topics. These are only a few of the remarks that do not as aptly describe her versatility as an academic philosopher, and we are very grateful to have her as the chair today. So, the first speaker of this session is Dr. and also Professor Sonia Sikka, and she will be talking on the topic Can You See Me? Race and Invisibility. Sonia Sikka is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Ottawa. Her primary areas of research are social and political philosophy, philosophy of religion, and German philosophy. Her current research involves the political management of religious and cultural diversity with a focus on Canada and India. Professor Sikka also works on critical philosophy of race, including racism in the history of philosophy, and participates in collaborative efforts to decolonize and multiculturalize the discipline. Ma'am, we are so very grateful to have you here, and I would like to invite Professor Sonia to begin with her talk.
I invite Professor Sikka to present a talk. And I would suggest that, she kind of wraps it up within 25
Thank you
minutes.
very
So
much.
after that,
I'm
we
very
can have
pleased to be here. I hope
7
everyone
minutes
can
of.
hear me okay. Is that enough? Yeah, great.
Yes. I mean, Professor Sikka, can I request you to present within 25 minutes, and after that, we can have 7 to 10 minutes of QA session?
Yeah, I have a paper written out, and that's what it's supposed to be read in. It's 25 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So my paper is on the concept of race and racism, but it does intersect with gender, as you'll see. Now, according to a common understanding of racism, it is a reaction to visible features, especially skin color, in combination with other elements of bodily appearance. I think it's fair to say that this is what most people assume and what they would tell you if you ask them what racism is. They'd likely say, well, racist belief, people who look a certain way, generally people who are white, or have fair skin as a population group, are innately superior to people who, as a group, are dark-skinned or have different facial features, hair, etc. And most people these days will also say that this belief is wrong and even absurd. But of course, lighter skinned people are not innately smarter, more virtuous, harder working, and so on than people with dark skin. On this view of racism, all that needs to happen to overcome it is for people to stop believing such foolish things, to stop seeing color, as it were, and to understand that no one is superior to anyone else merely because of their skin color. This popular view is also reflected in academic scholarship, in debates within critical philosophy of race. Some scholars within these debates maintain that the central task is to debunk belief in the reality of race, to show that there are in fact no human races, that there is no correlation between what are called phenotypical characteristics, visible features typical of different human population groups, and traits involving intelligence or character. But there are a number of problems with this seemingly common sense position. One lies in its assumption that racism necessarily involves beliefs about innate properties. In other words, that racism always includes the belief that the population groups in question are the way they are by nature. Historically, European race science, which emerged over the course of the 18th century, did maintain precisely this belief. It proposed to divide the human species into biological types, hierarchically ranked, their characteristics inherited through birth rather than acquired through environment and upbringing, thus inscribing a distinction between nature and culture. As Robert Bernasconi notes, however, rejection of biological racism, i.e., of the view that the human species is divided into races as natural kinds, is coming positive, but still leaves worlds of racism intact. Even if nobody any longer believed in the propositions of scientific racism, and so there were no more racists in this sense, he writes, this was to leave intact a world structured by past racisms that cannot be located at the level of thought because they are now, and probably were always, primarily located within practices that are sustained not so much by individuals, but by institutions both local and global. So then, not seeing race will not address social inequalities that have been produced by historical racism and are maintained by varieties of institutional discrimination. On the contrary, this limited variety of anti-racism can lead one to ignore these entrenched inequalities, and so can be positively counterproductive. Because while race is biologically unreal, it is socially all too real. On the one hand, and this is in Linda Alcoff's words, there is a newly emerging biological consensus that race is a myth, that the term corresponds to no significant biological category, and that no existing racial classifications correlate in useful ways to gene frequencies, clinical variations, or any significant human biological difference. On the other hand, there is the compelling social reality that race or racialized identities have as much political, sociological, and economic salience as they ever had. In some, still citing Alcoff, one can hold without contradiction that racialized entities are produced, sustained, and sometimes transformed through social beliefs and practices, and yet that race is real as anything else in lived experience with operative effects in the social world. Now, I've been citing from Alcoff's essay towards the phenomenology of racial embodiment, in which she then draws on Merleau-Ponty to show how, in the case of seeing race, perception of the visible is shaped by sedimented historical beliefs and practices. And yet that visibility is manufactured. Alcoff alludes to cases where literally imperceptible differences are made visible through social practices and perception. As in the case of the racialization of Jews and the Irish in Europe, for instance. Now, these are groups who could not be distinguished from whites, quote unquote, and that's also a constructed category, of course. These are groups that could not be distinguished from whites by skin color or other obvious physical features, which were nonetheless constructed as inferior races, with the lethal moral consequences of that construction, which historically was used to excuse genocide, slavery, and colonization. The ghastly genocidal turn taken by European anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany is particularly revealing in this regard. Anti-Semitism has, of course, a long history in Europe spanning almost 2 millennia. In Christian Europe, for centuries, Jews were demonized, persecuted, exiled, murdered, scapegoated, a host of imaginary evils projected onto them. And they were seen as a people. There's often no clear line between religion and ethnicity. Starting as early as the 15th century in Spain, Jews were held suspect as a people with a peculiar nature that was passed on to descendants, such that even conversion to Christianity did not bring equality. Now, that is centuries before the development of the biological concept of race in Europe. But already there's a vague view of Jews as having some kind of essence that resides in the blood. It's the word that was used, and is inherited. Such essentialistic othering is not so distant from racism. In fact, I would argue it lies at the heart of racism. Its prior existence made it then possible to construct Jews as a biological race in the 20th century. Europeans had by this time been using the race concept to support colonization, enslavement, and extermination of non-European peoples, of course. Nazi racial ideology fused that concept with existing anti-Semitism, the results we know. It's generally been seen as a case in which a religion was racialized, but I want to emphasize that the Jews had already been constructed as a people with an underlying hereditary essence that could not be entirely erased through conversion. That construction was present, as I said, centuries before the emergence of the scientific concept of race, and it tells us something about racialization. European Jews were not visibly different from Christian Europeans. If they converted, their visible identities, their dress, their expressed beliefs and practices were also not distinct. And yet they were held suspect as having an invisible, intangible essence that made them untrustworthy and threatening. They were perceived as such, though the markers were not perceptible through sensory organs. In Nazi Germany, this imperceptible essence was made highly visible through racist caricatures circulated as propaganda, which shaped people's view of Jews in, I think, a very literal sense. It was what some of them saw when their neighbors were taken from their homes and sent to concentration camps, a sort of manufactured visibility, as Alcoff says. At present, I think we see a similar manufactured visibility in perceptions of Muslims across Western countries and elsewhere in the world. Alia Al-Saji makes this point through a phenomenological analysis of perceptions of Muslim veiling. This is a religious practice, with which Euro-Americans seem to be obsessed, and we should start by understanding how peculiar that is in Western countries purportedly committed to liberal democracy and secularism. Historically, what we now call secularism originated as a response to religious conflict. It was a formula for political toleration, barring the state from either imposing a religion on its citizens or restricting their religious beliefs and practices. Liberalism, moreover, as articulated by influential philosophers such as J.S. Mill, is also about political toleration. It asks that the state not impose one way of life and thought on citizens, but allow them to follow their own plans of life and ideas of good, as long as doing so does not conflict with the same liberty of others or cause them harm. So, following these principles, there is very little reason to impose restrictions on what people choose to wear, especially when the choice is an expression of their conscientiously held religious beliefs. This should not even be an issue. And yet there are restrictions, and so much angry, anguished, self-righteous discourse about Muslim veiling in Western countries, liberal democratic countries, a practice that imposes no risk to or burden upon others. It's in this context that Al-Saji asks, whence these recurrent representations of and this obsession with Muslim veils? How are we to understand the persistence of discourses on the veil, repetitive in their representational logic, despite their manifestly diverse formulations and the differing veiling practices and contexts upon which they focus? The restrictions are imposed, sure, in the name of religion and secularism in France and since then the province of Quebec in Canada, where Al-Saji herself lives and teaches. But she argues that these discourses on the veil are crucially motivated by the association of veiling with gender oppression, which involves a certain representation and perception of Muslim women by others, since Muslim women themselves are excluded from the process of constructing their representation. So she sets out to understand the mechanisms that sustain these representations in the Western imaginary, proposing that, quote, what is at stake here is a form of cultural racism that hides itself under the guise of anti-sexist and even feminist liberatory discourse. The naturalization of gender oppression to veiled Muslim women thus permits the norm of Western womanhood to be constituted as free of such oppression as the only imaginable mode of female subjectivity. Now, the notion of cultural racism that Al-Saji invokes here, also called neo-racism, was articulated during the 1980s to name a shift in racist discourses, particularly in Europe, from Europe and the UK, from explicit reference to skin color or other physical features to talk of values and culture. In the UK, for instance, Enoch Powell made this infamous anti-immigrant and patently racist speech in 1968, which did refer to Negroes, but also to the different customs and religions of immigrants who supposedly refused to integrate. And increasingly, I think Western racism, that explicitly references race, skin color, etc., can't be expressed in public. So it's instead hiding under discourses about culture and values and so on. But the thing is, this so-called neo-racism is actually not new. European and then Euro-American racism has always been cultural. It has always involved ignorant, biased views, caricatures really, of the cultures of indigenous peoples, Africans, Asians, and these caricatures have been projections articulating and constructing the Western sense of selfhood, of elevation above all those inferior others. I'm always reminded here of Nietzsche's analysis of the pathos of distance within the aristocratic sense of selfhood, the psychic pleasure of feeling oneself to be above those who are low and vulgar. I think we can see this pleasurable psychic process at work in the racist consciousness of self and other among, for instance, canonical figures within the history of modern Western philosophy. What else is going on when Kant writes that the white race possesses all motivating forces and talents in itself, and that whites are the only ones who always advance to perfection? These are quotes. Or when he says that Hindus, meaning at this time the inhabitants of South Asia, all look like philosophers, but incline greatly towards anger and love, and quote, thus can be educated to the highest degree, but only in the arts and not in the sciences. Or worse, when he claims the race of Negroes can be educated, but only as servants, slaves, that is, they allow themselves to be trained. This is in spite of Kant's moral and political principles championing human dignity and stating that no rational nature should ever be treated merely as a tool. The problem is only white people, strictly speaking only white men, are fully rational beings in Kant's mind, and therefore capable of accomplishing the ultimate purpose of human existence. Kant was an important figure in the formation of scientific race theory in Europe, and he has a theory of hierarchically ordered and fixed races with whites at the top. But I would note that when someone like Hegel articulates his own hierarchical view of peoples and cultures, the tropes are much the same, although he does not rely explicitly on biological race theory. Africans, for instance, have no history for Hegel. They stand in a region of eternal night, sort of twilight zone between the animal and the human. Africa proper, he writes, as far as history goes back, has remained, for all purposes of connection with the rest of the world, shut up. It is the gold land, compressed within itself, the land of childhood, which lying beyond the day of self-conscious history is enveloped in the dark mantle of night. And this, the Negro, as already observed, exhibits the natural man in his completely wild and untamed state. We must lay aside all thought of reverence and morality, all that we call feeling, if we would rightly comprehend him. There is nothing harmonious with humanity to be found in this type of character. And Hegel sees the indigenous peoples of the Americas as physically weak, which is why he says Negroes had to be brought over as slaves. Because of this alleged weakness, Native Americans were therefore naturally vanquished by Europeans, a necessary step in the progress of reason. And if anybody wants to tell me that these people are products of their time, I'm happy to address that, because no, they're not. They are intervening in debates in which there are lots of contrary voices, right? They're taking up particular positions. Okay, and as to Asia, well, he says, let's see, China was characterized by a thoroughly unimaginative understanding, a prosaic life amid firm and definite reality, while in the Indian world there is, so to speak, no object that can be regarded as real and firmly defined. Okay, so my point is, with or without biological theories, the West is an imaginary formation that constitutes itself through representations of its racialized and gendered others, as Al-Sati writes. At present, one of those primary others is Muslims, with head coverings worn by Muslim women having acquired an outsized visibility and become markers of race as much as skin color can be. Markers of a visible otherness, immaturity, ominous backwardness, against which we, quote unquote, define ourselves as morally mature, egalitarian, and civilized. In France, and post-dating Al-Sarji's article in Quebec, we can see the conceptual gymnastics through which it is the Muslim veil and it alone that is stigmatized, that is a stigmatized religious sign in need of regulation. France's banning on wearing overt, quote-unquote, religious symbols in schools is part of that effort. And the very perception of Muslim head coverings as overt telling, Al-Sarji suggests, as it points to a visibility that is conspicuous and hence stands out in comparison to other religious signs, which, though also visible, remain discreet or normalized. So what makes the veil so very visible, she argues, is its association in the Western imaginary with the oppression of women, such that gender oppression is the schema through which the hypervisibility of the veil is constructed and by means of which it is racialized. As in the case of racialized bodily features, here too, vision is not a mere neutral recording of the visible. Rather, as Merleau-Ponty points out, we learn to see, and in this case, the learning generates generalized perceptions of Muslim women as sexually repressed and passive bodies hidden behind their veils, Orientalist tropes that are very much products of a Western and colonial way of seeing. Moreover, while the veil is hypervisible as oppressive and repressive barrier, Muslim women behind the veil are not merely invisible to the Western gaze, but are made invisible as subjects. The supposed oppression and repression of Muslim women, as signified by the veil, is hypervisible as seen through the thick historical lens of Orientalist projection. That seems to be just obviously what the veil is to that eye, right, to that trained eye, indicating the beleaguered condition of the women subjected to it who are in need of rescue. And at the same time, the women themselves are invisible as subjects. They are not permitted to return the gaze, or even just to represent themselves, to say how they see themselves. Their voices, and this, I mean this literally, right? They're very literally and concretely, their voices are rarely and never more than minimally included in discussions about regulation of this supposedly oppressive practice. For instance, Muslim women themselves were barely included in the Stasi Commission to Liberation in France in 2003 that led to banning conspicuous religious symbols, a law popularly and accurately described as the hijab ban. And the voices of Muslim women were also conspicuously absent in the public debates on reasonable accommodation held by the Bouchard-Taylor Commission in 2008 in Quebec. They have continued to be so in public and political discourses in that province, leading up to the implementation of the draconian Bill 21 in 2019 in Quebec, which bans the wearing of religious symbols by public employees. And which, by the way, is in violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But the Trudeau government won't take it to court for fear of alienating Quebec voters. Okay, so that law claims to be neutral, but it has been described rightly as racist, and everybody knows it's aimed at Muslim women. And by the way, there are studies also to show that it has increased incidence of racism within Quebec, and not just against Muslim women, but against all visible minorities, whether they wear any religious symbols or not. But thus, to cite Al-Sajdi's once more, the complex difference of Muslim women is reduced to the dimension of gender oppression, construed as existing solely within Islam. That last point is important, as this contrast is also how the Western subject constitutes itself as visibly superior. But focus on the veil, hypervisibility, deflects attention away from the patriarchal structures of Western or colonial society itself, which become invisible in contrast. Right, so this is a form of cultural racism where what is differentially visible is not skin color as such, but culture, defined largely through the perceived presence of gender oppression, ostensibly embodied in veiling practices. And this racism is covered over by the manifest anti-sexist and feminist concern for the liberation of Muslim women. In an essay called The Veil in Their Minds and on Our Heads, The Persistence of Colonial Images of Women, published in 1997, Homa Hudfar describes the many different significations the veil can truly have in historical and current political context, contrasting these with misconceptions about it and about Muslim women generally, as perceived by Westerners whose gaze is manufactured entirely by the media to which they are exposed. And Homa Hudfar, I mean, she is a feminist, long-term work in Iran. She was imprisoned there for I think it's about 6 months, and hasn't been able to return since. She reported in 1997 that in her 20 years of living in the West, mostly UK and Canada, quote, "Whenever I meet a person of white European descent, I regularly find that as soon as she ascertains that I am Muslim, Middle Eastern, Armenian, the veil very quickly emerges as a prominent topic of conversation." And she says, what I found remarkable is that despite their admitted ignorance on the subject, almost all people I met were, with considerable confidence, adamant that women had a particularly tough time in Muslim countries. Woodfire also underlines the dual function of this representation in how Western discourses, including academic and scholarly ones, define self and other while ultimately supporting patriarchy. The assumption that veiling is a static practice which symbolizes the oppressive nature of patriarchy in Muslim societies, the quote, has prevented social scientists and Western feminists from examining Muslim women's own accounts of their lives, hence perpetuating the racist stereotypes which are ultimately in the service of patriarchy in both societies. On the one hand, these mostly man-made images of the Oriental Muslim woman are used to tame women's demand for equality in the Western world by reminding them how much they are better off than their Muslim counterparts. On the other hand, these Oriental and negative stereotypes are mechanisms by which Western dominant culture recreates and perpetuates beliefs about their superiority and dominance. I want to add just one final point to this analysis of how the constructed other is both hypervisible and invisible to the cultural racism of the Western gaze. That Islam and Muslims have been demonized in the West, especially since 9/11, is something we all know. I think. And anti-Muslim bigotry in India also received a boost from that Western demonization and the security discourses connected with it. Those tropes have become global. But also in the West, this hypervisibility of the Muslim terrorists pushing out all other representations is combined with the long-standing invisibility of suffering and death of racialized others. That invisibility, any of us, who are grown up in the West, as I have, are very familiar with it. And from a utilitarian moral perspective, I'd like to point out that as judging by harmful consequences, this form of invisibility is arguably the most pernicious element within racism. Right? Let me return for a moment to the canonical philosophers I mentioned earlier, Kant and Hegel, though there's so many others one could add to this list. Think of how little the suffering of Africans and indigenous peoples is perceived when Kant says that, quote, Americans and blacks cannot govern themselves. They thus serve only for slaves. Or when he says of the race of the Negroes that they can be educated but only as servants and have many motivating forces, are also sensitive, are afraid of blows. Astonishing thing to say. Is there anyone who isn't afraid of blows? And what kind of blows are we talking about here, one wonders? Inflicted in what context? No. Or consider the ghastliness of Hegel's claim that Negroes, quote unquote, have no sentiments for their families. Among them, parents sell their children, and conversely, children sell their parents. Neither has the opportunity. To this want of regard for life must be ascribed a great courage, supported by enormous godly strength, exhibited by the Negroes who allowed themselves to be shot down by thousands in war with him. They had a lot of choice. Perhaps most telling of all is the account Hegel gives of the conflict between European settlers and Native Americans. America, he writes, has always shown itself physically and spiritually impotent, and it does so to this day. For after the Europeans had landed there, natives gradually perished by the breath of European activity. As one commentator laconically puts it, they took refuge in nothing. Think about how much violence, how much misery and injustice is rendered invisible by these laws. It's a very old and very deep feature of the Western racial gaze, this lack of empathetic imagination, the inability to see the suffering and humanity of the racialized other, to actually think that people, feel pain to the same extent, that they love their families, love their children, just as much as we do, as regular people do. We see its effects still all the time. We see it in the invisibility of Congolese children forced to work in cobalt mines in order to yield materials for batteries and cell phones, with the participation of Western multinational companies, including ones from my country, Canada, and the laissez-faire indifference at best of Western governments. And we see it right now in the peculiar invisibility of Palestinian suffering and death, peculiar because it is being live-streamed in graphic detail, and yet makes so little impact on political leaders who could bring it to an end, or on broad swathes of the Western public who will continue to support these leaders. The deadliest element in racism, I suggest, is this habit of the heart that somehow enables us not to see what lies in plain view. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Sikka, for this very illuminating talk. We can have 10 minutes of Q&A session, and I invite the audience to put their comments and questions to Professor Sikka.
Okay. I have a question here that when we talk about the visibility of the invisibles, do you think that their visibility is created in certain manner that they would never be able to be visible the way they want to be, like under the garb of homogeneity and under the garb of reducing them to a particular probably dressing style or language, the way they look, it is working in a way that it doesn't leave any scope for them to be visible at all. So I just want your opinion on this statement.
Well, I mean, I hope not. Like, I know I was pretty strident in what I said, but there's no point really in making this kind of critique if you think it can't be different. And so, although I was very critical, I think it can be different. I do think media, popular culture has a big role to play here. So that different representations of Muslims, that's important. For them to be good, what's required is always, in the case of minorities, not only Muslims, what is required is for the authors of these representations to themselves be from the minority population, and I mean, they're the only ones who can really put forward a proper self-representation, right? And that does happen in places. They're just, and to be fair, I mean, although I've been critical, there are also massive protests, right, about Palestine. There are in Canada too. There's strong pro-Palestine visibility, I would say, in Canada for quite a long time. So yeah, I do think it's possible. I'm in a philosophy department, and I am a philosopher, and so I mentioned attitudes of philosophers who are canonical figures within Western philosophy. One thing that helps is proper education, right? So, like, look, last summer I taught a course on philosophy of race and racism, and half of it was about racism in the history of philosophy, including Kant, Hegel, Locke, Mill, yeah, I mean, particularly philosophers associated with the Enlightenment and with liberalism. Not a single student. These are graduate students, MA, PhD. Not a single student had been introduced to any of this material before, right? So, yeah. So, no, I think it can be countered. There's all kinds of ways in which that has to occur. So, yeah, I try to do what I can in the sort of limited sphere that I have.
Any other question? May I ask for a clarification, Professor Sikka? I'm totally new to this area, and also I'm afraid the acoustics was not very good. Can you please clarify the notion of hyper visibilism? This is one, and secondly, also a very naive query that given the fact that often one's way of looking or what is called gaze is heavily categorized, and can they be a counter training? As how to the appropriate kind of perceptual gestalts and not be misled by certain undesirable or inappropriate categorizations?
Yeah, I mean, the second part of that question, thank you, is one that I was trying to address in part with my answer to the previous question. You know, let's face it, it's got to work at the sort of emotional level. It's got to stir empathetic imagination. And so, again, referring to my discipline, principles such as human equality, right, they're not going to be enough. You have to cultivate people's sentiments. And this is why I think cultural representations, media, television, and so on, are art, of course, are really, really important. And so speaking back and training people's perceptions and their hearts differently. Right? That's what has to be done. Hypervisibility. So I'm just taking that term from Alia's essay. Alia Al-Saji, and she uses it to talk about the way in which Muslim women are hyper visible, right? So people perceive like women wearing hijabs as extremely visible, but that hyper visibility, I mean, that visibility, that prominence is created, right? You can certainly learn to barely see it at all as a headdress. I mean, why? For all kinds of things, right? Who cares? That's manufactured, right? And that's what she means by hypervisibility. So then it's then seen as a visible or overt or conspicuous religious sign, right? But that's because of a certain way in which people are trained to see it. In Quebec, you know, so Sikh men who wear turbans are also affected by this legislation, by Bill, now Law 21. And it wasn't really, it's an unintended effect. They weren't the target. And yet when you think about it, I mean, isn't a Muslim turban just as visible, if not more visible than just a headscarf? It is, but it just wasn't constructed as being quite like it is more visible than it should be to people, right? More visible in the wrong way, but it wasn't constructed as quite so ostentatious as the veil. I can't hear. Is there a question? Muted.
Has raised her hand. Pooja, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. So thank you so much, Sonia, for it was a great listening to you. And I actually have a keen interest in the same area, but I would ask you the question which I have from a film perspective, because when we are talking about such events like this happening, when you're talking about 9/11, or maybe we can talk about the Hiroshima Act. West has always had more power through the media. So whatever movie that they make, even if the person or larger population does not know about that entire event, it makes more sound through the media or film that they make. Like Pearl Harbor, it got 11 Oscars. It's what exactly has been done. So they show a particular side of a story, and then that's when they get empathy. However, when we talk about especially in this matter, Israel-Palestine situation, the Palestinian people do not have that vocal space in media as such. Even if all the journalists and media person from Palestine are talking about these issues, they are somehow being sidelined from the larger community, and where they are talking that the one question that comes around, that do you condemn what has happened on October 7th? So on that basis, everything has been justified. So when we talk about in a narrative role, how do you think that the visibility can work in a manner to show other side, as well as the people, the group that is in power? Because we know that Israel has a larger ties with America, and the movies, and it's not a prediction, but I think more or less in few years we'll also be seeing a movie being made on this Israel-Palestine situation, where the side will be given to what has happened to people of Gaza, Israeli people on 7th of October, and how their family member have been inflicted. But how can we, talk about the visibility of people who do not hold any power at all? And that's the major concern, because in sitting in academic room, we can talk about the situation, but when it comes to the ground reality, how do we make it more visible?
Well, there isn't any way except changing power structures, right? And gaining representation. I mean, as far as films go, you're not, you're not going to get the films made and you're not going to get made properly unless you have filmmakers who are Palestinian, who are working with Palestinians, right? And then there has to be the possibility of respect for them, without that being censored as it is being right now. We all know that the Palestine situation is special. I mean, it's been made more complicated by sure. I mean, there's the power of Israel and so on, the institutional power, the nations, to political parties, and so on. But there's also the profound, Western self-reflection about the Holocaust. Yeah, I've written critically on Emmanuel Levinas. You may not know that, but when this started, I thought about all the conferences in continental philosophy that I've been to over the years, where not the pushback I got when I tried to get a Jewish moral philosopher, survivor of the Holocaust, the pushback and resistance I used to get when I would try to get Levinas's racism taken seriously, the sort of hushed tones in which his philosophy of the other would be talked about, and the impossibility of getting any other atrocity that Western Europeans committed, that Western philosophers, are complicit in, getting it taken seriously. I know this is sort of fire to say in Western circles, but it's fact. The fact that the Holocaust gets way more attention because it wasn't the first genocide. It was the first genocide that was committed against Jews, and exactly what happened is that the racialization, all the racialized treatment of Africans and indigenous people, which was horrendous, was now turned on people within Europe, and that is seen as unique. But it's unique because people within Europe who,
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thanks a lot, Professor Sikka, and also thanks a lot for the questions. I'm sorry that, though there are some questions posted, I can see, but we have to end the session. Maybe the inquirers can take it up with Professor Sikka. And we all thank Professor Sikka and all the, audience for making this session, by making this particular talk successful. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Rasia Islam, the next speaker, and I would, ask for a brief introduction of Dr. Rasia.
Dr. Asya Islam will be presenting her paper titled In the Middle, Gendered Navigation of Double Consciousness Amidst Socio-Economic Change. Dr. Islam is a lecturer in gender and work at the University of Leeds. Previously, she was a junior research fellow at the University of Cambridge. Her PhD in sociology, funded by the Gates Cambridge Scholarship, is also from the University of Cambridge. She is interested in emerging gender, class, and labor relations. Her research includes long-term ethnography with young lower middle class women in service work in Delhi, India, and ongoing projects on gender, digital technology, and the futures of work in India and Argentina. So I would now request Inakshi ma'am to invite Dr. Asya.
Hello, yes, Dr. Asya. May I request you to, accommodate your presentation within 5 minutes, so that after that we can have the Q&A session. Over to you, Dr.
Great,
Asya.
thanks. Thank you very much. Can I just check that everyone can see the presentation? Yes, I'm assuming
Yes,
everyone
we
can see
can.
it.
We can.
Great. Great. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Especially thank you to Dr. Ritu and Disha, who I know have put a lot of work into organizing this and have invited me to join all of you here. I'm sorry to not be there, and I'm sorry especially to miss the lunch and the post-lunch stupor. I would have very much liked to do that, but I'm nevertheless happy to be joining you from Leeds. So I'm going to talk today about my research that I have been doing with young lower middle class women in Delhi. To begin with, I just want to give you an overview of the research. I should also say I feel a bit like an interloper here in the sense that I'm not a philosopher, I'm a sociologist. I'm very much focused on gender studies. So I like to begin with giving an introduction to the research that I've been doing since mid 2016 with young women working in new service work. So these are young women in Delhi who work across a range of workplaces, including cafes, call centers, shopping malls, offices. But the fact that I've been doing this research since mid 2016 means that things have obviously been continuously changing. And I feel actually quite privileged to still have this kind of access to these young women who I started working with in mid 2016. So while they initially worked in cafes, call centers, malls, and offices, a lot of them have now transitioned to working into more of your kind of e-commerce companies and startups that are becoming a much more common feature of the urban Indian work landscape. Now, in all of this, I really understand work as an important site where there are contestations over and reformations of youth subjectivities. And subjectivities is something that I'm going to focus on today, especially in terms of thinking about it in relation to the topic for this conference, which is gaze. Importantly, what I would say is that even though I focus very much on new service work, so you'll hear me talking about these are young women working in service work, the kind of workplaces they're in, I look at work actually quite broadly, and I always think about work as very much interconnected with leisure, consumption, and domestic life. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because, especially when we're looking at women, it's quite important to look at their working lives in that it's very hard to separate paid work, employment, from their domestic lives, as well as you will see in this presentation, from the practices of leisure and consumption that are emerging in India and have been emerging for the last 2-3 decades following liberalization. So, in this overall picture, what I'm really trying to do is to think about youth subjectivities in urban India, but particularly through this intersectional lens of gender, class, and caste. So, when I'm talking about studying subjectivities, it's important to define how I understand subjectivities. I really like this formulation by Louise McNay, whose work some of you in the Department of Philosophy may be familiar with, who talks about subjectivities in this kind of dual process, and duality, something that's actually quite important to the themes that I'm going to talk about today in this presentation. But McNay talks about subjectivities as this kind of duality of subjectification, and this is very much drawing upon the Foucauldian framework of subjectification, where people may be subjected to certain identities or certain subject positions, as well as self-conscious stylization. So people consciously stylizing themselves to a certain subject position. Within this, what really interests me again as a sociologist, as an ethnographer, is the way people talk about themselves. So that's putting it in very simple terms, but what I'm really kind of attracted to is looking at how people narrate subjectivities, how they talk about themselves, what are the aspects of their lives they highlight and what they don't. And this is also very much a self-reflexive process. I might be introduced in a certain way by someone, I might talk about myself in a different way. So there's this kind of dialogue going on, which again will become visible once I start going into more of my research findings in a minute. I understand narratives not as stable and unified, but actually as fractured and changeable. And again, this is something that's become apparent in the research that I've been doing since mid 2016. The way these women talk about themselves has changed over that time. And in this, I really always end up thinking about feminist narrative studies, feminist critique of subjectivities and subject positions, identity, and the self, and so on in mainstream philosophy. So this is just really to say that when I'm talking about narratives, I'm not necessarily saying that there is a coherent sense of the self. I'm talking about narratives very much as narratives that can be fractured and that are changeable over a period of time based on a number of different factors. Now, gluing all of this into the topic that we're discussing in the conference today, which is the gaze. So when I'm talking about subjectivities, I'm not just talking about what people are like on the inside, but I'm thinking about subjectivities as embodied. In that sense, again, I'm drawing on feminist critique of philosophical conceptions of the self that have traditionally and kind of in the canonical philosophical literature talked about the self really as something that's on the inside. But actually, feminist sociologists like Beverly Skeggs, whose work I draw on quite widely, talks about how the self is actually also shaped by external factors. And in the context that I'm studying, I already made a reference to liberalization in India and thinking about post 1990 India. What does new India look like? And my focus is very much on urban India as well. I think about how subjectivities are shaped by socioeconomic change. So I'm still situating these women's narratives, the way they talk about themselves, in this wider context of socioeconomic change in especially urban India. So in that sense, what I'm particularly interested in is looking at subjectivities and social encounters. And again, there's that duality that comes out here. So in part, this is about how you see yourself in a particular social setting, but it's also very much about how others see you in that social setting. And these social settings can vary. And again, I'll talk in a minute about how when social settings vary, these subjectivities change and narratives around subjectivities also change. So in urban India, then what I'm really looking at is how these social settings and subjectivities are in flux. So they're not fixed. We're talking about changes that are ongoing, but actually what I'm also looking at in terms of these subjectivities is how things are changing, but also how things are actually staying the same. So again, this duality between simultaneous change and social reproduction is what my research focuses on. So I'm taking into account this broader framework of globalization, gender, and work in urban India. And I don't have much time to go into a lot of detail about it here. I'm just trying to give an overview, but of course, if you have any questions about it after the presentation, I would be happy to address them. The duality here that I'm looking at is how women are becoming both desirable in new markets and work as a symbol of modernity. And there's work by Ganguly Grace that's quite important here, where she talks about how women's presence in itself in public spaces is seen as a symbol of modernity for India. So women's bodies in that sense are desirable in these new spaces. And I should just say that this is not necessarily only limited to India. Actually, work by Professor Mary Evans, who's based at LSE, also talks about this with reference to the context of the UK, how there's been this shift from domesticity being something that was respectable to now women being in work, women becoming professionals being seen as something that's respectable, that's modern. So there's this new construction of modern respectability through women's participation in work. What we see with that is this simultaneous backlash against women's public presence, where women become out of place. Women are not seen to naturally belong in these public spaces. So there's desire for their visibility on the one hand, but also backlash against them and kind of pushing them away from those public spaces, trying to make them invisible. So we were talking about visibility, invisibility, hypervisibility before, and all of those themes do come into play here as well. So what I'm looking at really is how women's entry into this kind of new service work that I study is entangled in these conflicting discourses on gender, and I think about gender very much as intersecting with class and caste, but looking at these discourses on gender and modernity, and again talking about them as being conflicting, not something that's kind of fixed or coherent or necessarily singular. Within this context of globalization, one of the things that I do, one of the strategies that I adopt for my research is actually look at things that are in circulation. And what do I mean by things that are in circulation? So these are things that have global symbolic value. To a certain extent, the kind of workplaces I'm talking about, your cafes, shopping malls, call centers, they have symbolic values. We see them in urban India, and they represent a certain kind of modernity for India. Similarly, in our everyday lives, there's interaction with things that have global symbolic value. And there are a number of things that I look at, but I'm just going to focus on three here. I'm going to talk about the symbolic value of English language. I'm going to talk about jeans, and I'm going to talk about cars. And again, I'll come to those themes in a second. So women's narratives engage with these things that have global symbolic value, but these are very much fractured narratives that reveal a double gaze, which is what I'm focusing on here, or a double consciousness at play. So as I said, I'm going to focus on three things here. I'm going to look at English language, I'm going to look at cause, and I'm going to look at genes. So when I'm looking at English language, I'm thinking about the skills that are required to enter new service work. And the subjectivity that I'm focusing on here in relation to the thing which is English is that of Madam. So let me read out a couple of quotes from two of my interlocutors. So Prachi is someone who worked in a cafe when I first met her, and she was very friendly. She spoke English actually quite fluently, and she told me, I really like reading novels. You know, everyone says the kind of locality I'm from and the kind of school I've studied in. I went to a government school. Everyone says it doesn't seem like that. I mean, my spoken English is good. Everyone asks me where I learned English, but I actually never went for classes. I've never even gone for tuition. It's all so expensive. So Sheila is another person who worked with Prachi in the cafe, and they became friends with each other over a period of time, and we all ended up hanging out together as part of my research. Sheila wasn't very comfortable speaking in English. She had learned enough English to be able to secure work in the cafe, but she wasn't very comfortable doing it. And in these exchanges that I had with Prachi and Sheila, when both of them were together and I was hanging out with them, Sheila often kind of attacked Prachi for trying to speak in English too much with me. Sheila would say things like, Madam, don't be such an Angrez, don't be so English. Even ma'am, so referring to me, even ma'am speaks in Hindi to us. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and again, not enough time to do it, so I'll limit myself. But the first thing to say really is that English here is a symbol of class and caste to some extent as well. But importantly, what the function of it is here is that of an essential skill that's required to now belong in new service work, where there's an expectation, especially in this kind of interactive service work in cafes, that the workers would speak in English. So in terms of English speaking, then these women are also demonstrating upward mobility beyond just their participation in new service work. But what we see here is in this conflict between Prachi and Sheila that speaking English too much can actually be seen even by peers as excessive, and there can, in that sense, be a pushback against it. So saying, don't be such an Angrez, don't be so English, even ma'am speaks in Hindi to us, is telling Prachi that when you're at work, you speak English because that's what you're required to do there. But actually, when we're hanging out separately, when we're not at work any longer, when we're just being social with each other, there's no need to show off your English skills. So there's some conflict going on there in terms of how Prachi sees herself and wants to portray herself, and how she's pushed back into her station by her peers, and how she might be seen by others in settings outside of work. So this very much links with what I was saying earlier about different social settings, different subjectivities and fractures that emerge through those changes, really. The second theme that I want to turn to is that of embodiment. So thinking about what kinds of bodily presentation are required for fitting into service work. And the thing that I'm focusing on here is genes. And the subjectivity that I'm thinking about is that of a heroine. So Jahanvi is also someone who worked in a cafe. She worked in a donut cafe in a shopping mall in Delhi. And she told me that when she started work, the second day at work, she said, I cried a lot, but I didn't tell my parents. I cried because some girls at work told me that I shouldn't try to be a heroine when I'm there. They told me that I should wear my work dress from home. So just to give you a bit more context about this, Jahanvi used to wear jeans and a top, and she would go to work and then change into the work dress there. And the second day at work she was there, she was reprimanded by some of the women who were her colleagues, who said, don't try to be a heroine. And again, this is a really, really interesting subjectivity, a really interesting subject position to explore, because in really trying to tell her to not be a heroine when she's there, what her colleagues were doing was saying, you're pretending to be someone you're not. So in dressing up in this particular way by wearing jeans and tops and then coming into work, you're trying to be too smart, you're trying to be a heroine. She was again pushed back by her peers. Neha, who worked in retail in a shopping mall as well, told me that that happens a lot. You get dressed, you go out in jeans and top, you see that the girl is roaming around. Nobody looks at themselves. If our parents don't have a problem, then why do you have a problem? But then I don't care either. Like when I used to come here for the job, people would say that the girl is going out, she started doing a job, she comes back so late at night, wonder what the area is like, she comes through lonely roads. All of these comments would start. And even when we shower and get ready for a party or something, even a little makeup, they'd say that their girls are going out like this. Now, I think with Neha's narrative, what really comes out is that duality of how Neha wants to see herself. So there's an assertion of, I don't care, this is how I want to dress, this is how I belong in service work, this is how I belong in the new India that I want to be part of. So I don't care about what people are saying. But what's interesting about this narrative is that there is actually quite acute consciousness of what people say about her. So she's very aware that they're talking about her going for this job, she's leaving at a certain time, she's coming back late at night, she's going out for parties, and there are judgments in her neighborhood, in her community about what she might potentially be doing. Obviously, with the kind of suggestion that the work that she's engaged in is not respectable work. And there's this kind of blurred boundary between professionalism and promiscuity when it comes to women's participation in work that I think quite a lot about and that emerges a lot through these narratives. So these new appearances, similar to English speaking, are a key part of becoming service workers for these young women. There is a pride that they take and an assertion that they make in transforming their appearance to be more Western. So they're trying to move away from tradition and domesticity to become these service workers. But at the same time, these new embodiments, as we see through both Jahanvi's and Neha's narratives, can be seen as suspicious and potentially promiscuous by their peers, neighbors, and communities. So again, they are then pushed back in these changes that they're trying to effect to belong in new service work and in new India. The third and final object that I engage with for the purpose of this presentation is that of cars. And the subjectivity that I'm looking at here is fast forward. So I'm very much thinking about new attitudes, and this is where the link with work, leisure, and consumption all kind of comes together. So the new attitudes that workers are expected to espouse as part of becoming service workers, as part of belonging in this new India. Both of these quotes here are from Chandni, who worked in a range of different jobs. She'd worked in a call center, then she went on to work in a cafe, and then she changed out of that and worked in events jobs and so on. So Chandni told me that in her first job, she said, I hated boys before. My personality now and before is very different. Rohan, this was her boyfriend, used to say, what kind of girl is she? And his friend would tell him, you should see her after she takes a bath. She's really fair. She deliberately looks like this. I didn't like it at that time. He used to irritate me. But Chandni did actually get over this irritation and she started going out with Rohan at work. And then Chandni said, Rohan used to take me out in his car. He had a nano. Office people got us to talk. Then they said Chandni turned out to be very fast forward. But I wasn't attracted by his car or bike. I know besides love, you have to think of finances, but that wasn't it. Now again with Chandni, there is very much that kind of duality between how she saw herself, but importantly actually how she saw herself also changed over a period of time. So she talks about a change in her appearance, which we saw also with Jahanvi and Neha with the discussion that we just had. But she actually connects this change of appearance to her personality and to her attitude towards practices like dating, pursuing romantic relationships, going out in a car, eating out, and so on. Chandni talks about how her personality before, and this is before entering work, is different to her personality now. So she's talking about participating in new leisure and consumption practices as being quite important to establish worker subjectivities. Women discuss this change in their personalities, as I said, as a result of participating in work. But again, these changes were very much challenged by their peers and again also by their families, neighbors, and communities. And again, this idea of being fast forward is really interesting, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want to. But I think there's something going on here in terms of saying you're trying to do all of this too quickly. So there's a certain pace of it, that pace of the change that's not approved of by her peers and by families, neighbors, and communities. So coming to this idea of double consciousness, what we see is that there are obviously new skills, embodiment, and attitudes that are under double surveillance, that of the women themselves and that of others. When I'm talking about double consciousness, I am very much drawing upon the social philosopher Du Bois. Again, some of you may be familiar with the work that's been done by Du Bois. In sociology, Du Bois has not been part of the canon, but is actually increasingly being talked about, and there is emerging work expanding on this idea of double consciousness. So Du Bois talks about double consciousness to understand the double self-perception of oppressed African Americans. And really, I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but what double consciousness gets at is this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. So there's an inward perception, but there's also a perception of how others are looking at you. And what I'm really trying to do here is think about these tags, madam, heroine, fast forward, that I've just discussed, as very much gendered as we see through the narratives of women. And I'm trying to think through these gendered tags in terms of developing an idea of gendered double consciousness. So, how women's self perception in a changing and yet unchanging patriarchal context is subject to a similar kind of double consciousness in the way that Du Bois talks about it. I'm not the first one to actually be doing this. I'm just kind of trying to expand on this idea. It's been mentioned here and there in other people's work as well, but not really brought together in the way that I'm trying to bring it together here. So I'm thinking about women really as mediators of socioeconomic change. We know that women are often the ones who take the middle way to navigate these tensions between tradition and modernity, domesticity and professionalism, globalization, and still wanting to stick to local cultural values. Sarah Dickey, whose work I really like, talks about how being in the middle for people is closely associated with the pressure to uphold social mores. But actually, this is something that can be both desirable, pleasurable, as well as unstable and anxious. And this is something that I do see with my research, and that becomes apparent through the quotes that I've shared with you as well, in that women are quite agentic and assertive in the changes that they're making to themselves, but they're also quite anxious about how these changes are being seen by others. Gauri Vijay Kumar also talks about flexible aspirations for women working in a BPO on the outskirts of the city of Bangalore. She talks about how these women distinguish themselves from these two subject positions of both old-fashioned village housewives and promiscuous urban call center girls. In a different context, Amy Cox talks about low-income black girls and young women in a shelter in Detroit, US, and talks about this idea of double consciousness through her interlocutor's narrative. So she writes about one of them saying, for Janice, the missing middle is the thick, complex, richly textured, and uncategorizable aspects of the lives of young low-income black women, and that is what constitutes their truth or their legibility as fully human. The words convey a double consciousness that is both aware of external assumptions made about black girls and attuned to the fact that black girls create their own measures of success, health, and happiness. So I'm just ending it here. I'm aware that I'm starting to, I think, run out of time. But what I'm really then thinking about in terms of these subjectivities is the way that the process of identification takes place. So women do stylize their identifications of subjectivities as English-speaking, jeans-wearing, dating women, as agentic and pleasurable, but they are also conversely subjected to identifications that contain pejorative and derogatory tones that come to coalesce around the same subjectivities of madam, heroine, and fast forward. Now, Beverly Skeggs argues that women distance themselves from injurious subject positions through this process of disidentification, that of emphasizing who they are not. So while in most of the literature there's focus on looking at the process of identification, Skeggs really draws our attention to the process of disidentification of women saying who we are not. So, for example, women saying we're not housewives, we're professional workers. But what I find in the context that I'm studying is that there's actually simultaneous identification and disidentification, which I understand through this concept of mid-identification. So women kind of trying to place themselves in the middle of these subject positions, but also actually shifting their shape a little bit, which Amy Cox also talks about with reference to low-income black women in the US. They're shifting shape depending on what kind of social setting they're in. So whether they're at work, or at home, or with their friends, or in leisure spaces, their identities keep changing, and they navigate this through mid-identification by simultaneously identifying in and disidentifying from these subject positions. So what I really find overall is that in this changing socioeconomic context, there are contestations that are actually quite heated, quite polarized at times as well over emerging subjectivities. These contestations, importantly, are not only between young women and their families or communities. There can be a tendency to think of youth as the new generation who are very much, in tune with these new subjectivities, and their families or communities as traditional or backward. But actually, what I find is that there are these contestations among peers in this broader context of reaffirmation of patriarchy and social inequalities, including in new workplaces that are otherwise understood in popular imagination as meritorious and offering equal opportunities to everyone. What I find is that, and this is something that I've written about, women adopt this plasticity of forms, so this kind of malleability, again, this idea of mid identification, to simultaneously identify and disidentify from emerging subjectifications to navigate this context of socioeconomic change alongside the reformation of patriarchy and social inequality. And I will end there. I've just got a list of my references as well in case anyone's interested in picking up some of the scholarship that I've talked about. But thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Islam, for that very organized talk and also managing the time absolutely perfectly well. So I hope that there will be many interesting observations and questions. Please, this is Sandra, a student of MA second semester, sorry, fourth semester.
For presenting this. It was very Thank you for presenting. It was very informative. However, I wanted to ask you something related to the current trends that I see. So your work is on young adults and especially women, and also on the urban area and how things are changing in the urban area, with emphasis on how globalization has changed the economic and social situation in India. And your reference, as I saw while you were showing us that wonderful presentation, had studies from 2010, 2012, 2013, which was a very crucial period for India in economic sense, where IT sector bloomed, and while we still had some progress in terms of internet availability, it was not so much as now we have. Today, internet is a big thing. Everybody has a cell phone and everybody has unlimited amount of data, and one can do anything one pleases. So I believe, in your terms, if it is safe to say, there is a third conscious, a collective conscious that is developing on social media, where young girls and young citizens come together and they shape discourses that are not just limited to economy but also social structure and especially identity of individuals. And I think from there it has taken a serious bloom of what is politically correct and who is somebody to tell us what we are. So I would just like to ask you, what is your take on this other aspect of India, which is digital?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So, yes, I completely agree that with digitalization and technology, things are changing, and this is where my research has progressed as well. So, if you remember in the beginning, I was talking about doing longitudinal ethnographic research. What that meant is that women who used to work in cafes, call centers, shopping malls have now actually moved into more technology driven work, such as an e commerce startup. So, there's definitely change that's happening with digital technology. There are two things that I would say in relation to this. One, uh, the idea that everyone has access to digital technology is not true, right? So we know that there are a lot of inequalities in access to digital technology. So even if you're talking about it in just kind of very basic, very simple terms, in terms of access to smartphones, speed of internet, just availability of internet, it varies hugely. I've done some research, including a survey in both rural and urban India, and there are big rural urban differences when you look at things like this. There are also actually big gender differences when we look at things like this. So, in urban India, what I would say is that the picture that's emerging is that most people do have access to internet and they do have access to smartphones. Less so for women. Women are often not exclusive owners of their smartphones, but share their smartphones with other people in the family. But that's kind of diverging from this. I just wanted to put that in as the broader context of what we're discussing here. In terms of connecting digitalization with identities, subjectivities, the way women might look themselves, what opportunities technology might offer them to craft their identities, I think this is a really exciting area of research, and there are lots of scholars who are writing now about digital intimacies. I don't know if that's literature that you've looked into or you're familiar with, but digital intimacies really looks at how intimacies and, in that sense, kind of romantic relationships, social relationships more broadly, are being mediated by digital technology. And they talk about how, in some ways, this offers freedom for kind of making your identities, and freedom, especially for women who might not have freedoms in the kind of offline world, they might have freedom in the online world. But there are also other scholars who are much more critical and talk about there isn't such a kind of clear-cut divide between the online and the offline world, right? And a lot of what happens in the offline world is actually replicated in the online world. And I think that does very much fit in with the kinds of things that I see, even though I'm not looking at digital intimacies, I'm looking at service work and workplaces. In workplaces, there's this idea that this is a kind of neutral space where young people have equal opportunities and both men and women can participate equally. But actually, what I find is that that's not the case. These are spaces where patriarchy and kind of what are seen as older social inequalities are very much being reasserted. And I think we see a similar trend when we go to looking at things like digital technology, social media. We know that while women are able to kind of craft new identities, subjectivities on social media, they're also subject to a lot of violence and trolling on social media. So I think this is something that we need to be aware of, again, thinking about the duality.
Okay, thanks a lot for your clarification. Any other question? I would like to, kind of just a very small query that, when you talk about double consciousness or double gaze, why double? Because it is not a case of two persons, but one the mode of subjectivity or one mode of this self-conscious stylization. It's getting agonized or being challenged by certain other, kinds of way the people they are being looked at others. So, is it necessary to have the word double?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question as well. So I like using the word double because, as I said, there is quite a lot of sense of this duality in a lot of the narratives that these women are presenting. So the reason I use the word double is because the women talk about not just being conflicted about this. They're not just saying, oh, like this is who we are and someone has made a comment on our appearance or on our attitudes or on the kind of work we participate in. It does very much kind of emerge as this consciousness in two parts. So there is consciousness of socioeconomic change of the world that India is now and of wanting to belong in that. So there's a certain, again in Louis McNay's terms, a self-conscious stylization that's taking place there. And they're doing this quite consciously. It's a reflexive process that they participate in. But on the other hand, and I think this is where really the kind of the dual comes in, they're also very conscious of how they're being seen by others. So the gaze in this sense is double in that there's a gaze that they're subjecting themselves to, and there's that kind of element of self-disciplining going on there. But then there's a gaze that's outside that they're being subjected to that they're also very conscious of. So I like to use double consciousness because I think it really illustrates the kind of conflict that's going on there in terms of their processes of identification.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Islam. If there are no more questions, we would like to end the session. Of course, thanks a lot to you, and you've been able to bring up a new purview in this whole theme of case, and very empirically informed, and opening up the theoretical potentials. So thanks to you, and thanks to all the audience once again.
Thank you very much.
We start the next sessions. The next speaker would be Dr. Pooja Raj. I would just ask, for a brief introduction of Dr. Pooja Raj.
Dr. Pooja Raj will be presenting her paper titled Redefining Masculinity Through the Female Gaze, a Shifting Perspective in Contemporary Philosophy. She is currently teaching as an assistant professor at the Alliance School of Liberal Arts at Alliance University, Bangalore. Her areas of interest are feminist philosophy, gender studies, film studies, media studies, and cultural studies. She has published several articles, including her recent publication of an article in a Sage journal and a book chapter titled The Politics of Information in Changing the Narratives, a Cinematic Approach, in the book titled Democracy, Media, and Indian Society. She has served as a former gender champion for the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. She was also one of the core members of the organizing team of the first All India Philosophy Graduate Conference in February 2020. She was also the core team member and representative of Minorities in Philosophy in online certificate course on feminist philosophy. So, Professor Mitra, if you could just invite Dr. Pooja Raj to begin with her talk.
Yes, Dr. Pooja. May I ask you to to manage the time within about 17 minutes, given the time constraint? Will that be okay?
Yes, ma'am. I will be
Okay.
trying to restrict my PPT as small as possible. If you would allow me, I would
No,
like to share my screen.
share screen? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, sure, sure.
Is my PPT visible to everyone?
Yes, it's coming. Yes, yes.
All right. So thank you so much, Meenakshi ma'am, for inviting me. And for that, I would just like to take 30 seconds to just uh, thank of my gratitude, because I remember one of the first students to talk about and to try to defend my MPhil thesis on male gaze, and from there the journey of being one of the invited speaker to talk on this gaze seminar is a big privilege for me. So I would like Ritu ma'am and Nakshi ma'am and everyone included in this one thank you all of them. So as mentioned by one of the introducer, that my paper is titled as Redefining Masculinity Through the Female Gaze, a shifting perspective in contemporary filmmaking. And I would like to rectify, because the person who was introducing me, she mentioned contemporary philosophy. So I'd like to rectify it's contemporary filmmaking and not philosophy. Um, so moving forward, I'll just like to start with one of the very famous quote by Jean Bourgeois, that we never look at just one thing. We always look at things in relation to how things are between things and ourselves. So this is why when we say that things are just like that, it's always that's a fallible argument, because we always see things in relation to ourselves. When we are talking about gaze, that seems a very interesting, because gaze, as we are talking in the seminar, holds different perspective and different context and different epistemology, different field altogether. So moving forward, my paper has just dealt with few research question here, is that what is female gaze, what is the role of female gaze, and its role towards deconstructing traditional masculinity, or what we call patriarchal maleness, and the role of female gaze in redefining all of that. And then some of the work done by our contemporary filmmakers, especially female filmmakers from West as well as from India. So just to start with, just very introduction, that when we talk about gaze, I have worked extensively on the aspect of male gaze. So from there, when I take the shift to understand female gaze has already tried to understand female's perspective. But however, there are still so many queries about what is female gaze. Is it rightly in opposition to what male gaze is all about, or just when women objectify men, is it the same which is called female gaze? It's not that. So this is why I believe female gaze require a larger intervention. And there we what, especially in the act of film, because gaze, yes, it's available in our everyday to day life, from morning to looking at our own self. But I'm just going to take it towards the major aspect of film and filmmaking, where camera holds the gaze. So film in gaze in film majorly is an act of viewing and conveying a subjective truth or perception, or majorly to describe and identify the lens to which a director shows an audience, and that provides the way how audiences look at the character on the screen, or be it character, be it a narrative, be it a story, everything is provided by the directorial perspective. So that gaze plays a very integral role. However, the term female gaze emerged in opposition of the term male gaze, which we have been listening since the morning, that it is in reference to the voyeuristic nature of the camera lens, or not just in camera lens, but in any way how male gaze is being how male gaze work to understand female and female sexuality. So that has always worked towards the sexual pleasure, which this word was again propounded by Laura Mulvey in 1974. So taking that forward, as mentioned, it's not the reverse of objectification of men by women, but a critique of the power dynamic that we have been talking and taking for granted in our society, in our cinema, in our media, in such. And this is something which power dynamic is inherent in the way or act of looking and being looked at. So this is why it's not simply is an opposition of male gaze, but it is developed as a when a film uplifts women's desire and their sexuality or their pleasure or their perspective as such in the forefront of the plot, the film. So this is one major idea which I would like to use with the one of the comical one, that it's not just the reverse, but on the surface, the world
Pooja,
through the eyes of yes.
yes. Do you want the slides to be changing, right? It is
Yes,
only one slide.
is
It is
it
only
visible
one
that I
slide
have
that is
changed?
being visible. It is only one slide. They are not changing.
Um,
Yeah, now we have got on another slide.
So,
Okay.
all right, so I will just keep in the shorter mode. So yes, so I just use this slide, which majorly tries to cover that what this female gaze try to do is that it provides a eyes to the central female character, but it's not really restricted to the female character. But majorly, what it does is that it provides a perspective of how women look at the world, how women look at the other character, how women look at a particular story, a particular person, and which majorly what film gaze through directorial perspective provides is that it allows audience to see what women feel and experience instead of just being gawked about and look at their body, or look what you are going through and how this person feel, but majorly to focus upon their emotion, their individuality. And that's why female gaze has taken a larger uplift or resurgence in the society in the last 5 to 7 years. It has been existing before, but then since the digital media has been globally available, people have been talking about problems that male gaze brought, and then in parallel to that or in opposition to that, understanding female gaze. So just to I would like to quote one of the idea which was mentioned, that female gaze has become a means to explain perspective that female filmmaker or indeed author or any writer bring to a film or a piece of literature. This term itself is coming from film theory, and that it explains that women on screen do not exist in the film just as to be viewed or just to be looked at, but they should exist without fetishism or objectification as an individual, which provides their value, which provides the human value to them, not just as an object. So this female gaze gives a female's eye to look at the world and try to find an opposition to female gaze, but not in a very objectification manner, but as a power dynamic which has to be changed. So this is what we have observed, and to the work that I have found, that is that male gaze is also not inherent in a society, but it's also a cultural behavior which can be changed, and it's not something which is stagnant, but it has also potential to change the moment we change the power dynamic. Yes, it will take longer time, but it is possible. So this male gaze is something which is based on the hierarchy of power structure, which requires us to change that dynamic, to change the stereotype that are available. So, and it's not that only female have been the victim of male gaze, but men themselves have been restricted and defined in a very stereotyped role, that how men have to be, and they have to be strong, they have to be active, aggressive, they have to be the breadwinner. And the moment a male member does not fulfill that expectation out of them, they are being scrutinized and they have been demeaned to the male gaze as well. So male have also been the equal victim of male gaze as well. So taking that idea forward, here's the female gaze has brought up with an idea, this theory which is called male power fantasy, where a lot of male directors have mentioned that when we express or when we showcase male actors or characters, it's majorly what we think that what women wants. But this is exactly where male audiences or largely any member presume that it is exactly what they want to be, because female members or women fantasize about these characters. So this terminology has been given a larger boost in the last 5, 6, 7 years about the male power fantasy, where actors, superheroes have been presented in a very macho form, and they are presented as that they are the one ideal person which women fantasize for. But it's something which is very different. So I have another very comical slide for that, where what male writer and director think is about what women fancy men like this, and then they exhibit that in their movie, and then viewer also understand the same way that women fancy men like that, and they learn from that. But here the larger part is missing about the female perspective of understanding what female really want. So that this is why female male power fantasy has bled into everyday life, like what we see in the dating apps, to the profile, and everything. So what we understand that is that men set the standard, beauty standard, not just for women but also for men, and then that's how the power dynamic has been constructed. But then here I would like to quote Judith Butler when she also mentioned that it's not something which is biologically there, which is biologically fixed, but it's socially constructed. And so if and we have been talking about that femininity is not biologically there, but it's socially constructed, and so is masculinity, which we try to understand. So the major part where we try to understand is the how a deconstruction of traditional masculinity really works, and what we also call patriarchal maleness. So taking the idea of Sigmund Freud and what Foucault has been talking about, they specifically highlighted about the idea of cultural construction of subjecthood. That whatever we are is because of the cultural construction that has we are who we are. So here I would like to quote one of the article, one of the phrase from the article written by Catherine Belsey. She mentioned that cultural construction theory suggests that gender imaging is not also unidirectional but must work in both directions, so that the gazer in himself or herself as much influenced by the act of gaze as in the subject of the gaze. So it's when we see the male gaze happening, it's not just affecting women but also affecting men in a manner to for them to ingrain that idea that this is how they have to be, and that is affecting both ways. It's not just unidirectional, and thus entails that there's a causal understanding for gaze, where in the sense that masculine identity is also never created in isolation, in which we call that it's not only it's not only the social image of femaleness, but also how we understand masculinity is also coming from the image of men from femaleness project. So just like how we understand men is not coming to directly in opposition to female has to be understood, but how female also look at men and what they try to understand in men as an individual person. How we have seen the recently some change in the pattern of film and filmmaking, and this recent change in the pattern of filmmaking has made the force and direction of the gaze is also no longer just left with exclusively masculine, and that the female equivalent is also beginning to enlarge itself. It started to become noticeable. They are starting to grasp audiences to talk about how men should be look like from a female eyes. And then in colloquial language, we have got this terminology called men written by women. And that's exactly how in academic language we perceive that masculinity is the case. There's another quote which I would like to mention by Pam Morris is when she mentioned about in the literature and critique of that critique of culture is that the dominant ideas about the male gaze emerging from feminist movement are that any gaze that appropriates the other in its scope is by definition masculine, whether by a man or by a woman. That the gaze is based on the hierarchy of power relation in which male is always dominant, and the gaze is by its very nature monolithic, since its function is appropriation. And that's where the criticism comes, that we cannot, just like we have to criticize the way we have been criticizing the essentialism for femaleness, that women are nourished, motherhood. They have the motherhood. They have to be nurturing, and they have to be careful. They are to be a motherly figure, and all these essentialism that have been associated with women and femininity has also been attached to men and masculinity as well. And that's where the cultural appropriation has been understood, and that needs to be shifted, because that same definition provides a masculine perspective. So, and it has been also mentioned by not just feminist theorists but also masculinist theorists as well, that to retain the distinction, that they have also made a distinction between patriarchal maleness and the subjective femaleness, and attempt to reinterpret that maleness or masculinity by deconstructing the patriarchal framework. So the most of the gaze which we see, what male or female, is majorly a reflection or an image or an idea of an archetypal or ideal image of the other sex that we are talking about. So this the gaze here becomes therefore an expression of an ideal version, an ideal in each gender that we want to see in another gender. And that's how even Jacques Lacan has also been understanding, and he talked about the same situation, that when we have when we have imaginary, when we have symbolic, and when we have a real understanding or real image, we have to distinguish these understanding, and that ideal image creates an impression in other gender to form an understanding of how they want the other person to look at. So male gaze try to understand women in a very physical manner. Female gaze try to understand male in a very emotional manner. So that taking forward, and that's exactly the input of how women want to see male members, or how they want to see masculinity or maleness, has been somehow been redefined by some female filmmakers. Taking that perspective forward, we have so this idea of female distinctly, when we talk about that, when women make a movie, they somehow are distinctly female gaze, but that's something which is questionable, because most of the female directors have also been making movies that have been questionable, that has largely held male gaze. And this is where one of the another quote which I want to mention is that when it has been mentioned that when women want to understand themselves, when women want to understand the world, they do not have any other lens to understand it than my male gaze. And that's why it takes a conscious effort, conscious attempt to understand what female gaze is, because women are also oriented and they have been grown and brought up in a same male gaze and patriarchal society. So they have to make a conscious effort to turn it towards understanding female gaze. This topic majorly, where female are making the movies about women and their life, they are talking about sexuality, their career, they are defying misogyny, patriarchy, subverting certain stereotype. How, on the contrary, when we are talking about masculinity through female gaze, or the what colloquial word is that men written by women, in cinema it refers to where male character and their experiences are crafted, they are developed, and they are portrayed from by a female perspective or by a female filmmaker, which can cover director, scriptwriter, cinematographer, and all of that. So this approach majorly offers a unique perspective on masculinity and redefining, as not I would say redefining, but make an attempt to redefine the construction of masculinity or the male character beyond this traditional toxic masculinity or stereotypes that we have seen in mainstream cinema. So, and this is where most of the female directors and script writers, cinematographers have been also talking about that when they want to represent women desire, it's majorly what they want to focus is the emotional intelligence and someone who is typically unafraid of expressing themselves, because that's where the emotional part of women trying to understand the world comes from. That when while masculinity is a very valid way of expressing oneself, the female gaze theory also sees things beyond physical appearance, without physical characteristics, and they try to overpass or surpass the stereotypes that has been feuded in our society for a very long time to expressing gentleness. So the emerging conversation that we see these days, not from our day-to-day conversation, but also in media, in dating life, in marriage setup, in every way, they are talking about the conversation about gender and sexuality, and how they have shifted the axis of what people desire is no longer just the physical attributes, but the emotional attribute, which is very important. And it's no more just an individual hiding behind those stereotypes, because it's no longer working. And those people who are still holding those stereotypes are being criticized for not changing their perspective. So here's one quotation, or this word which has been given by Ashley Connor, who she's another cinematographer, who has made the movie called Juliet and Margaret. So in that one, and she has specifically, when she was interviewed in one of the magazines, she mentioned that the male gaze seeks to devour and control, whereas as a female gaze, she make an attempt to understand, and to where she approached the subject and material in an emotional and respectful manner. So she mentioned that when she tries to make a shooting, or when she holds a camera, she tries to be very particularly sensitive and openness to experiment and searching for failure as well, because that provides that she is an individual, she is a human, and she can make she can have a wrong perspective as well. So that's where they are trying to break that archetypal, that ideal version of male or female in that manner. And they want to come, and they think that I want images to come alive, and I think that perfection is boring. And that's her perspective on how she holds the camera for when she's shooting for me larger films.
Pooja,
So,
can you please conclude now?
yeah, so just a few pointers that when we talk about reconstruction, when female directors are trying to reconstruct masculine norms, they are trying to look into 6 more dimensions, where they try to represent diverse representation, some emotional depth, relationship dynamic, challenging their stereotypes which are there, exploring their gender roles, and trying to show the empathy and understanding. So based on that, I have some film clips which has been made by female directors or cinematographers or script writers, and what they have tried to execute. This movie, which called Old Joy, tried to express male bond. I don't know how many you watched, but it's very interesting, which provides a very different approach from a female perspective and how male bond or male friendship works. Another one is about the fatherhood by Sofia Coppola in the movie Somewhere. Another movie is by where about the rider, where she talks about where Chloe Zhao, who is also is the Oscar award-winning director, she has talked about the identity and how male cowboy and other identity has been shown in a manner, and how the identity can be challenged. I believe most of you must have seen the movie series Fleabag, and how it talks about the attraction and what works for women and what does not work for women altogether. We have some Bollywood example about movie from movie Razi, where the person, the male person, male written by female director, he understands the personal boundaries of women. Then we have another example of Piku, where the screenwriter was Juhi Chaturvedi. She tried to make the character of Rana or Irfan Khan here as supporting and understanding, and not trying to judge how she was trying to live her life. Then we have trying examples of men trying to showcase the equality and rights for women, and they stand for that. And another example about the sensitivity, about how women show sensitivity in men through, one of the example is you put here is through Dear Zindagi. So with that, I'll just like to conclude here that when we talk about defining masculinity or defining femininity, there's no fixed definition. It's always open for changing depending upon the idea that we are living in, the situation that we are living. So essential stereotypes are now slipping away. So this is why these kind of transformative movies, or these movie which holds the transformative potential while challenging certain stereotypes and social norms, are very important and needs to be taken more into consideration. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Pooja, for your bringing so many films and the details about films and the perspective of this very theoretical philosophy. I think that we could have the next talk, and after that talk, we can have a joint Q&A session. I would invite Dr. Disha Asija to give her a talk. That will be the last talk today, and I would also ask for the brief introduction of Disha before she starts.
So our final speaker for the day is Miss Disha Asija, and her paper is titled Deconstructing the Gaze, an Analysis of Politicized Looking in Anti-Caste Films. Disha is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. She is the campus representative of minorities in philosophy, and her research interests are in social and feminist epistemology. Her published works can be found on digital platforms like Feminism in India and Smashboard. So I would like to ask Professor Mitra to invite the last speaker of the day to begin with her talk.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible. So I know everyone's tired now. I'll try to make it quick, and I have very big shoes to fill following Sonia ma'am, Asya ma'am, and Dr. Pooja. So after listening to everyone's presentation today, especially after the first session, I was feeling a bit like at crossroads, or perhaps like staring at a brick wall, because I was reminded of how in Dr. Nilanjan's class, he was saying that, how postmodernism is not relevant now, globally. I mean, clearly it has some relevance in this seminar, but it just came to me, and how Professor Rakesh was also saying that we as philosophers need to limit ourselves to philosophy and our resources, and how perhaps not, reach out to film theorists and critical study theorists, and, so I do find myself at a chokehold, but at the same time, I'm also liberated by all these thinkers who have referred to these works. So I guess with their support, I will begin. So my paper is titled Deconstructing the Gaze, an Analysis of Politicized Looking in Anti-Caste Films. So clearly it is located in the context of the anti-caste discourse, particularly in films. Um, so, uh, yes. So I take this to be a presupposition that there is an issue of minority representation, and from this particular premise, I draw 2 points that representation is controlled and it is influenced by power structures, and B, this control is defined by who is looked and how they are looked at. So, what I problematize here from these two, A and B, is that there is a politics of looking between subjects and objects of gaze, which is, I mean, it is elaborated by certain people. I just want to reiterate this point that there are indeed subjects and objects of gaze, especially, let me limit myself to the context of films in Bollywood when it comes to representing caste minorities. There are indeed subjects and objects. Uh, so, of course, there's an excessive saturation of particular communities in Bollywood films. I've made this point clear. Yes. So, let's talk about Foucault and the Panopticon. I want to say that the power structures and the hierarchies that are there in our society resemble the Foucauldian Panopticon. And why do I say that, and why it's relevant for my context is that the prisoners are, of course, the objects of gaze, the watchtower and the jailer, if at all there is a jailer in it, becomes the subject of gaze. And this goes on to a point so much so that the prisoner internalizes the gaze of the other so much that it comes to a point that they start self-disciplining and self-policing themselves, which is of course the hallmark of surveillance as disciplinary power that so many speakers were talking about today. I mean, this is what they or someone, I don't know, perhaps all of us want to come at, wherein we as people police ourselves, which is surveillance or surveillance power, as Gabriel Mann was talking about. So I want to take this example. There's this very famous paper by Sandra Lee Bartke. She, echoes this similar point, and she says that women resemble the prisoner of the Panopticon. How? Because the Panopticon itself is symbolized by patriarchy, and women become the prisoners because women constantly are fixated on their own bodies. I mean, there's so much going on in their minds that, oh my god, how I'm looking, how I'm being perceived. My is the length of my skirt at a proper length? Is my lipstick okay? Is my hair okay? So much so that they start policing themselves. Again, a reiteration of all these points. So I would like to take this point and move further. So I would request everyone to please keep these premises in their heads. I would like to, now move to Bollywood and how control is operative in Bollywood and how it is manifested in the context of representation of minorities of caste. So, yes, what do these characters have in common? I'm pretty sure everyone is able to gauge at it. Very weak, very not able-bodied, very dark-skinned, and all these characters come from Dalit Bahujan communities in these films. If you have, and you know what? A funny thing is that this Gopal character in South, and if you Google this particular character, this actor, he's not that dark-skinned, and you can actually see when you look at this movie that, oh my god, what is he? What is put on his face so much so, and why was it relevant to show him as a dark-skinned, sorry victim kind of a character? And this is what I am trying to problematize, and this is what I mean that they are objects, because clearly they don't have the power. I mean, the characters and people in general don't have the power to show them as they really are. And the Brahminical gaze, or how we want to look at them, like they are, like, these characters are a manifestation of how we look at them and not how they actually are or how they look at themselves. And this is what I want to deconstruct. This is what resisting really means. Resisting this Brahminical gaze in films. Again, reiterating that I'm talking about in a very limited context. So, of course, I will be talking about bell hooks, and I will also be defending bell hooks. So, what are we resisting? We are resisting a misrepresentation, or a complete absence of representation at all, which resulted in a violence of marginalized agents as subjects of knowledge. Clearly, they were not allowed to contribute to the production of knowledge. I hope that all of us do believe that movies and media do contribute to the production of knowledge. So clearly, there was an absolute objectification, and that is why bell hooks coined this term, the oppositional gaze. And because of the discussions that we were having previously, especially in the first session, I just want to ground bell hooks oppositional gaze to in this context that she was coming from a position of critiquing a token or a state of no representation, a, and b, she was saying that when black women, if at all they were represented, they were showcased as either extremely hysterical or extremely sexual. So these are two set of camps, that bell hooks was resisting. So I mean, I did find some reductive tendencies uh, of some of the previous speakers, which I mean that's why I'm saying that I want to defend bell hooks. And her oppositional gaze means that she wants to move beyond both these camps A and B, and she wants to look at everything that is happening. And clearly, oppositional gaze is not a loaded gun. It is more of an epistemic orientation of critique and not criticism. I hope we do understand, right, as philosophers, the difference between criticism and critique. So I want to reiterate that oppositional gaze is an epistemic orientation of critique. Yes. So yes. Now again, how is an essentialist Brahminical gaze in films deconstructed? I want to morph bell hooks conception of oppositional gaze into what Manju Edachera calls an effective expressive gaze. Now, all these directors that we are seeing, they come from the margins of caste, and the movies that they have directed, you will see that the characters in those movies are very, very different from the characters that I discussed in the previous slide. So yeah, what is effective expressive gaze is basically she has morphed Meluk's notion of oppositional gaze, and she says that when we are resisting and when we are deploying this sort of gaze, we are also being empathetic. We are also looking at Dalit Bahujan people from a non-exoticized lens. We are looking at them how we would look at ourselves. The depiction is honest, representation is honest. It is normal, not the Foucauldian normal, just normal, and it is honest more so because the position they are coming from, they know what they have, the evidential content, the experiential content. So there is this shared solidarity of lived experience. And these are the movies they have directed. And if any one of you has seen even one of these movies, you would realize that the characters here, they are heroes. They are main characters. They are very assertive. They are loud. And not loud as hysterically loud, but loud when it comes to asserting their identities and asserting their thoughts. So yeah, I mean, all of them are very enjoyable movies. I would definitely recommend go and watch. So yeah, let me move. Let me make my presentation more philosophical now. So I talked about deconstructing the gaze, and clearly deconstructing the gaze in context of films. Let me talk about how in the Foucauldian panopticon, how do I place my very limited paper in context of the Foucauldian panopticon. And when I say that the panopticon resembles the power structures of casteism, racism, patriarchy, etc., etc. And what is it that these anti-caste films have done to deconstruct this panopticon? So dismantling the panoptical effect is what I mean. So recall that I said in the beginning how that there is a relation of subject and object in these films. Now it is also important to consider whether objects were always objects, whether they were never subject, or whether they are not subjects in themselves. Was there never a subjectivity? So anti-caste films and their analysis show that there is a reclaiming of a subjectivity that was lost. Why it was lost? It was lost because of power, because of a power structure, because of surveillance, because of normalization. So there must be something. What I wanted to do when I was writing this paper, I wanted to find a scope in the Foucauldian thesis of the panopticon itself, wherein I could see that okay, there is some trace of subjectivity that I can see, and this is what I want to trace, or something I want to dig it out. And luckily for me, American sociologist and philosopher Nick Crossley does that very well for me. So I just have to summarize his argument. Uh, I didn't have to do that on my own. So what he says is that yes, Foucault, he does not, of course, entirely, and this is the last slide of my presentation. What he says is that, of course, Foucault is not wrong entirely in theorizing whatever he has theorized. It's of course very, uh, I mean, it is important, and but he does say that we need to take a step back. Let's take a step back and analyze what is the what is this objectivity, and uh, what was it in the perhaps in the earlier stages of it. So he says that if we look at thoroughly at the prisoner him at the prisoners themselves, because Foucault was constantly reiterating this point again and again. If you have read Discipline and Punish, that the prisoner never communicates anything. It's always the person in the watchtower or the presence of the watchtower that's communicating that, hey, you are under surveillance, you are under surveillance. And he says that, yeah, I mean, actively they are not communicating anything, but they do know that they are subjects of communication. So there is a different kind of subjectivity that Nick Crossley is saying they have. That, okay, yes, they are not speaking. I mean, I am not speaking, but you're hearing me, right? So there is a different kind of subjectivity that is going on there. They are communicated that they are now under an omnipresent gaze. I mean, women know that we are under the gaze of patriarchy. Caste minorities know that there is a Brahminical gaze. I mean, even if that's not how they conceive it or conceptualize it, but yes, they are aware of the structure that is there. So the power which is affected, this is a quote, the power which is affected within the panopticon is affected precisely through the interhuman meanings which it embodies and communicates. Second point, he says that the panopticon's full effect is realized only after the surveyed internalizes the constant feeling of being looked. That is an act directed towards self consciousness, and consciousness is only a disposition of subjects and not of objects, really. Seems like a redundant point, but I think it's important. I mean, clearly, this book or laptop cannot be self conscious. In short, the outcome of self disciplining through self perception is more fundamental for the ideal operation of the panopticon. So, again, in my opinion, I think that Crossley does not really puts it that way, but I think that he was trying to make a case for a different kind of subjectivity that the prisoners of the panopticon embody. And I think that is very important because for my case, it works very well. Like it strengthens my argument. So, yeah. For some concluding remarks, I would say that reclaiming law subjectivity becomes the battleground for resistance. And for my context, anti-caste films, subjects only become objects with the effect of power. Anti-caste aesthetics offer an oppositional effective lens that not only resists but also cares for the becoming of Dalits. And again, this is forward-looking. A critique that Bell Hooks was getting in the earlier talks, that is oppositional gaze not forward-looking, and I want to argue that it is. So via these movies, Dalit subjects are able to dismantle such an essentialist gaze that they are able to own their narratives. They are able to represent themselves. They come from that positionality of empathy and honesty. And while resisting, the marginalized subject also communicate in the form of retaliation and dissent. So clearly they move beyond when they move beyond the Foucauldian notion that they never communicate. In this, they communicate. When they dissent, they communicate. So there is a different kind of subjectivity. With this, I would like to hand over the mic to Professor Anakshi.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Disha, and to make a very engaging and captivating presentation, and within such a short time. It was very organized, very well organized, and very well managed. So we have these two talks, both of Pooja and as well as Disha, and I would like the audience to kind of make the session more lively with their questions. Yes, here is Balaji. He is a research scholar.
My question is not to particular any particular talk, but whether are we speaking here for against the theme of gaze or social construct? I just want a clarification. What are we speaking for or against? whether we are criticizing the male gaze or we are criticizing the social construct. If we are criticizing the social construct, then we should also criticize the female gaze as well. But if we are not criticizing the social construct, we are only criticizing male gaze. And if it is also male gaze, I think every individual has a different gaze. By universalizing male gaze, I think the concept is a little bit bigger if somebody can make it more precise.
If I'm not mistaken, I think Balaji has raised an interesting point that, conceptualizing gaze itself is a gaze, meta gaze. Yeah. So if if the speakers can't, put their comments or clarification. I mean, yes, if, Disha wants to respond.
I would like to answer only half of that question. I mean, with context to male and female gaze, I would like Dr. Pooja answer that part because again she has that specialization. But I mean, the gaze that we are talking about, of course, I think it's a plurality of gazes, right? I mean, there's no one conception of a gaze, and you're right in pointing that out. And I think when you're saying that we should be criticizing female gaze, and I do believe that Dr. Pooja's work does that. In um, looking at it from a holistic perspective, for the lack of better word. And even when we were working on the concept note, we never wanted it to be limited to just male gaze or just female gaze or just film theory. We wanted perspectives from philosophy, sociology. We wanted it to be very disciplinary, of course. So gaze, just like as a dictionary word, of course, it can be applied anywhere, and I do believe to use it as a hermeneutic tool. I think yes, we had no intention, and I think no one here has any intention of limiting it. So does that answer something? Yeah.
I would like to take that forward. Thank you, Disha, for starting that conversation. But yeah, so I believe all of us, not me right now, I'm virtually now sitting in the same philosophy department, and because we are trying to understand and philosophize this entire concept of gaze, I'm not trying to say that the male gaze is wrong or maybe the female gaze is wrong. Actually, female gaze has also been criticized on certain level, but my position is that how male gaze has dehumanized and demeaned women as a human being, and it has turned them towards an object, and that's why the female directors have started looking at the world, not just looking at the male member, not just as an object, but as a human being, as an individual. So what female gaze and the philosophers who have tried to, theorists who have tried to support female gaze, what they have tried to do is they try to showcase that what male gaze has already done, we do not want to do that again to male members. We are just trying to understand other member, male member, or any other member as an individual, be it a woman or a male. We try to understand their emotion, we try to understand their experience, and because everyone's experience is different, we need to understand them from that perspective. So, female gaze in film just try to showcase each individual's experience and their life and their emotions, not try to subjectify or objectify them in any manner. Just try to understand the individual in that. If I have answered your question.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Ma'am, may I ask a question? I am online.
Okay, yes, Alok Tandonji, there is a question online. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Since morning I was hearing and wondering, is there no moral or good male gaze, a loving gaze? We are only talking about gaze in negative terms. And the second question, this can be related to the second presenter, that a film, Sujata, take it for instance, where the heroine is coming from the Dalit background. And the hero, Sunil Dutt, is, when two lovers look at each other, whether they belong to higher caste, higher class, or the Dalit class, do they look at each other in the same manner which we are talking today? or there is some difference in their looks which cannot be conceptualized in some sort of a power structure or this what we call a social construction. So where will you put this romantic love which is showed in films, literature throughout the history in terms of this conceptualization of these? Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your question. So I'll start with the first point that you have mentioned about having a third perspective where the lovers can also express their perspective. Approach is all about when we definitely that's where the criticism comes when that how would and that's why we are philosophizing gaze because every individual holds a different gaze altogether. But the moment we universalize and when we put essential quality attached to a particular gender, that's when essentialist perspective has been criticized and what female gaze or male gaze have tried to do is that they were trying to, male gaze have tried to actually essentialize that norm, that role, or that image of women to women. But what female gaze was trying to do is that it was trying to, detach that essential part of male member being like that or female member being like that, and they were trying to deconstruct and detach that attachment of essentialism from that perspective. So this, especially again in film, definitely when movies, the largest number of movies that are selling is romantic movies, and definitely there is a gaze involved in that one. But then when the moment we essentialize a woman with that she has to be this particular kind, or when we attach a man to be a particular kind, that's when the problem comes, and that's where this perception and these gazes need to be philosophizing. The gazes need to be understood in a very different perspective.
Yes, Ravi, please go ahead.
Okay. My question is to Disha about some clarifications. One of them is she talked of caste minorities, and then once or twice she mentioned to portrayal of Dalits. Was she referring to Dalits as a caste minority, and vis-a-vis whom? That is one clarification. The other is that she talked of Brahmanical gaze. I would like her to clarify what does she include in that. Does she include the gaze of Brahmins alone, or does she include other castes and communities also as part of Brahmanical gaze? Because I feel giving some substance, content to it will be useful. Otherwise, your talk becomes open to question as to what you. I'm saying great a little bit more of content to what you mean by, let us say, Brahmanical gaze, and you refer to deconstructed gaze. What all you included in that? It was not clear to me. For instance, just because, let us say, you reverse roles, that just making a few characters of a particular cast more assertive, right, makes the movie anti-caste, or there's something else to it. So I would like to have clarity on that also. What, in your opinion, is an anti-caste movie? Otherwise, it can just be that any movie, there can be different kind of movies which will be putting, different characters of different backgrounds into assertive or dominant or positive roles. So I think these clarifications will help. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this question, and it also gives me a chance to talk about something that I couldn't in my presentation due to the paucity of time. So yes, so there are certain layers to your question. I will try and address them all. So first of all, you asked me who are these caste minorities? Who are these?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So caste minorities, of course, I do realize that there is the word caste minority or the word Dalit, Bahujans is an umbrella term, and there are, because our society is such that there are various layers within these these sociological categories. So and I was even when I was writing this paper and when I was brainstorming it, I did get this this idea that it is perhaps what I am doing is sort of essentializing all the Dalits, that they are perhaps all the same. And but in the context of anti-caste films, I want to, and in the argument that I am making, I want to make it clear that even if it's essentialism, it is a kind of strategic essentialism that I'm deploying, because given the historical absence and absolute absence of the questions of caste in Bollywood, I believe that makes sense, because because again, the directors that I mentioned and the characters that I mentioned, and given that the actors who are playing those characters in the movies, they themselves come from these backgrounds. So I do believe that, of course, it's not the end, but it's a good start. And if this start itself is somewhat strategically essentializing a certain group, it is I believe we can accept this only and only when it is still in the beginning, like in the initial stages. Of course, I don't visualize it that 5 years down the line we would still be limiting to such representations. I would want there to be much diversity, even when with respect to caste minorities, quote unquote. So that is one. Second was this Brahminical gaze, right? So about the Brahminical gaze, of course, it's not the gaze of Brahmins. Brahminism, perhaps it's a gaze of Brahminism, as it's a gaze that gets normalized, a gaze of surveillance that gets normalized because of this caste society that we have, and it's very similar to, if I can make that analogy between patriarchy and caste system, although only vaguely in the weaker sense. I would say that how the patriarchy also has a gaze. I mean, of course, the people who are quote unquote upper caste or savarn, they are also subjects to that gaze. I want to make that point clear. And so clearly, it's not that the Brahminical gaze is working only for or only against the caste minorities and is always working in favor of the Savarna people. But yeah, it's more of a totalitarian structural gaze that I'm talking about here. Yeah. There was another
No,
question.
but do you? But no, but I'm saying, what is the content of the Brahminical gaze? That's not clear to me.
Oh
For
yeah.
instance, if by that I mean that the individual roles are fixed by birth, let us say, right? If let us say, this is just an instance I'm saying. I'm not saying this is what Brahminical means, but if that this is what Brahminical was to be taken to mean, then and if I am a Dalit, and I also believe that my social role is defined by my birth, etc. Now, will my gaze will also become Brahminical? Because I may have be having a particular caste and which may be subject to let's say oppression, exploitation, untouchability,
Yeah,
etc., etc.
yeah.
But still I may be ascribing to in what you mean, like if what I have said is the Brahminical meaning of Brahminical gaze, then I may still be, if not Brahminical gaze, at least Brahminical thinking. Then I may also be indulging in that, and just
Yeah.
because I belong by birth to a particular caste does not shield me from ascribing to such identity.
Yes, yes. This is, I mean, I have to say that this is indeed a very complex question. I mean, just because to say because for anyone for that matter, even for myself, that because I was born in a certain family, was born with a certain caste background, that I have that kind of gaze. But I would like to, I mean, setting aside feelings of empathy, trust, self reflexivity, which I think many of us here do subscribe to those values. I want to say that there is indeed a certain set of norms. There is indeed a social imaginary that is given to us being upper caste agents or subjects. Whether or not later in life we hold on to them, whether we you know deconstruct them is something that is very subjective. But yes, I mean, the social imaginary of our society is such that we are, there is indeed some kind of norms and ideals which are oppressive, stereotypical, etc., etc. And while I am on that, and I do think that I cannot answer that question entirely. But tomorrow, Professor Vandana has this talk on Brahminical gaze, and then if I am not able to answer your questions, I believe that she is the right person who would answer all these questions. Thank you. Oh yeah. Oh my.
Okay, Professor Vandana, please put your question.
Hello. Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes, Ritu Jaiswal, it's true that I will take up this issue of the Brahminical gaze, which I've tried to explain what I mean by using that term. And so I hope the persons who are asking questions to Ritu would listen to what I have to say tomorrow. But what I wanted to ask you,
Asking
Ritu,
Disha,
is-
not Ritu.
Oh, okay. ठीक है. Anyway, whoever can answer it, I will also have something to say on it. I am asking Ritu, you talk about anti-caste films, but you didn't give us even a single example. And so, you know, or maybe I missed that part of your talk. Did you mention some titles? Yes. Okay. I'm so sorry. All right.
If there is no other, okay, there is no other online question. So we have offline 2 questions. I think that I saw Sandra raise her hand, and after that, Tarang. Okay.
My question is to Dr. Pooja Raj. Thank you for the very illustrative presentation. So, usually the movies that are aimed at young females or generally young adults, and they are labeled as empowering movies for the female character where she takes over the office, or she goes to Harvard after being dumped by an ex, or she takes care of the baby successfully as a single mother, or she's an feminist environmentalist. It seems on surface that it does away with gays. She is no longer just an eye candy in a movie, but she's still a candy. For though a movie is woke, it often involves characters played by young, skinny women, or a certain very male-centric attribute containing women. While there is obviously an economic reason in the movie business to cast a person like that for the given fan base or whatever, isn't then the movie inherently gaze loaded? And then there is a second follow-up. I want to give an instantiation of the case. So the Barbie movie, which was labeled, I think, the year's greatest feminist movie to be ever made, while it successfully does away with some showing some serious problems with hypermasculinity, it claims to do the same with female, showing them as being empowered. The whole movie, however, one has to note, the whole movie starts with the aim to help Barbie to not age. That's the whole agenda of her going back to the normal world or whatever. And there is also an instance of an omniscient narrator voice where the narrator says, quote, that Margot Robbie is not the correct representation of female problems or whatsoever, so we casted a wrong person. It's a joke. It's supposed to be taken as a joke. But it's a serious fundamental feminist issue with the movie. Where and one might contest and say Margot Robbie, we casted her for being a beautiful woman, which all of us would agree. Where does, and that poses a serious problem for us feminist thinkers or academicians, because where does the gaze diminish and appreciation for aesthetics begin? And where does the feminist discourse start and where does it needs to stop? I need to ask this question.
Thank you so much. So on that one, I will pick with the first question that you asked. That the moment you show the case setting, that if a woman has been shown as a candy, how does it work, and how would we call that movie as a woke movie? Well, again, I'll take back to this idea of male gaze that sometimes a lot of movies have been made consciously to try to showcase a female-centric movie. So this there's a term, there's a distinction between what we call women's film, where women are the protagonists, where the story revolves around women, but it's shown from a male perspective. However, that women's cinema, which is a conscious effort to make women's emotion being shown, women's experience being shown, and not just essentialize again them to a particular attribute. However, I would like to mention that just because a woman is pretty, just because a woman is still beautiful and shown as a candy, even if she continues to embrace her feminine part, or be wearing pink, or be all bubbly, or in order to take a vengeance on her boyfriend, or in order to get back to her boyfriend she wants to have. But these all are the traits which is also showing somehow a female's emotion, female's way of living a life. So they again, this is where feminists, a female gaze, try to understand there is no right or wrong way of representing women's experience, because there's always some different kind of experience. But you have to show them instead of essentializing them that this is how women are, this is how women should be, and this is how women have to be. So this is where the female gaze try to focus upon, that they try to discard and they try to get away with the essentialism. And again, your experience can be very different, my experience can be very different, and female gaze try to showcase that. So even when, so taking from there, taking forward that question on Greta Gerwig's Barbie movie, yes, the whole attempt was majorly to try to understand and get the not age at all. But then, if you remember that the end part when they're actually talking about that, actually, I don't matter if my thighs are started to have some stitch marks, or if I start to age, if my if my I cannot land perfectly. And that's exactly, I believe somehow it tries to make an attempt to show that you don't have to be perfect. Yes, because we live in a kind of world where we have to be in a perfect manner, like like in Barbie, where she is living in a perfect manner. But that is not the reality, and that's why sometimes when the reality breaks in, it's a conscious effort to actually accept that reality. And that's something which towards the end of the movie she tries to make and try to mend, that she wants to come back to the real world. And I don't know, the movie was somehow being left with the an open-ended perspective, where she goes and she has an appointment with gynecologist. We don't know if she wants to have, real reality sexual organ of a woman or does not. We don't know, but that's the directorial perspective that I leave that open. That what exactly what she wanted to say. But as a audience, as a spectator, when I watch that movie, I believe that yes, towards the end, she also tries to essentialize that a woman can be a woman if she has a particular physique. So if my interpretation of the movie is that if towards the end Barbie goes back to real world and talks, wants to have an appointment with gynecologist to have a sexual organ like a woman to feel everything, then that's again a essentialism that women can only feel if they have a certain kind of body system. But that's where it's leave it open. That's where the movie also ends and does not show what she actually does with that appointment. So it's all open for interpretation.
Okay, thanks. Last question, Dr. Tarang. She's an assistant professor of Miranda House.
My question is more of a clarificatory question from Disha. Like she, in the beginning of the presentation, she said that she is trying to, the talk on post-structuralism and destructuralism, postmodernism is, giving us alarms about moving away from this discussion on, this relativizing kind of a discussion which is present around us. And so I somehow was not able to see how you have not used that kind of discourse in your presentation, because that's what we did, right? We saw what is a gaze, and how when people are looking at each other, there are power structures involved. And you also quoted from Foucault. So there also, I thought that when Foucault is defining power, and whatever literature around it, he has not acknowledged gender, as far as my understanding is there. He has not acknowledged gender. According to him, it is the power which one set will have over the other, which will determine the discrimination and whatever else. So the gender question is not so much there in Foucault. So if you can clarify these two things.
I mean, I was not trying to move away from structures. I was not trying to move away from postmodernism. I very much ascribe to those postmodern ideas. I mean, if that's what your concern was, I mean, the panopticon and the Foucauldian idea of power is the very crux of, is at the very crux. But I was saying that it's just in one lecture. We get this idea from someone. So and because in the earlier sessions there was also debates around whether film theorists are philosophical enough, and again this entire debate of who is a philosopher. So I just wanted to start off from that point, that I was feeling a bit unsettled, thinking that my paper is a bit redundant. So that was all that I wanted to say. And yes, the question of gender, I mean, yeah, I don't believe that Foucault specifically talks about women. He doesn't, yeah. But there are, of course, his interpretations have been taken up by, say, Sandra Lee Bartke, as I just mentioned, and of course, a lot of other feminists and um, um, feminist postmodernists also ascribe to Foucault's ideas. So
Then what I thought was that, of course, there should be an acknowledgement of discrimination. And then this kind of an exercise, my concern basically is that this kind of an exercise might reduce itself only into acknowledging that, okay, this is what is going wrong. So are we moving beyond acknowledgements? That's my concern. So we have acknowledged that there is discrimination and there are these power structures involved. I mean, where is the move? What have we said beyond that, philosophically? That was my concern. I mean, that's a generic concern in a like a philosophy conference. So I just thought, what is happening?
You can hear us through this laptop, right? So my laptop logged out, but I think you can hear us from it. I think Professor.
I mean, my concern is like from coming from a philosophy teacher. I'm always wondering this. I mean, in any conference on feminism, definitely. So I mean, we have to move beyond acknowledgements. Acknowledgement. I mean, yes, we should acknowledge and we should put it at the fore and discuss these things as substantial discourse में. But the thing is that what philosophical move are we making? Uska we should acknowledge that. Yes.
I mean, it's indeed a very big question.
No need not answer.
No, no, I'm
That
not
was
answering.
just
I'm
a
just
comment.
contributing that it is a very big question. It's very important.
But I am glad you are my student. I
Yes,
hope
yes,
you.
I am. She taught
So
me
you
in
did a good
undergrad.
job.
Okay, so thank you so much everyone for being so patient. And I think that if it continues, we will literally become patients. So, and thank you, Professor Inakshi, for chairing the session, and everyone here, online and offline available. Have a good day, whatever is left in the day. And we will join tomorrow at 10 o'clock, online only, not in a blend mode. And thank you so much, all our speakers, whoever can listen to us. Okay, bye bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.